Okay, hi. For those of you who are watching live, this is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you on uh, the webyeshiva.org platform. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. We are using the Shlomo Pines edition, and I am speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, at the Bayit Beth Avram Yosef of Toronto. Again, if you're watching this live, I hope you had a meaningful Tisha B'Av, and hopefully we'll all be together with you in Jerusalem next year. But in the meantime, let's get started on our subject for today. We are about to begin chapter 30 of the second section of Moreh Nevukhim. So we're well into the meat of the guide. And if you want to follow along in the Shlomo Pines edition, you can find it on page 348 in the Shlomo Pines edition, which we recommend that you get a copy of. It's the best English translation that we're aware of that is currently available. Okay, so I have an extensive outline today because there's a lot of material. We're going to break up chapter 30 over two parts. We'll do part one today and, God willing, part two next week. I recommend that if you have the ability to do so, that you download the outline, which I'll put on the screen in just a moment. And you certainly can just listen. If you're listening to a podcast, you can follow along. But it is helpful if you like those visual aids of having an outline. I think this will be very helpful for you. You can get the PDF of the outline. You can get it both from Facebook. There's a Facebook community called Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and you can also get it from webyeshiva.org's website, where they have a course description for this course. Section 2, Chapter 30, Part 1, The Act of Creation Re-Explained. Okay, so let's get our bearings. We had a very important last few paragraphs of Chapter 29. You know, it's interesting for the bulk of Section 2, for the majority of Section 2, for the last several chapters, the Rambam has made good on his promise to defend the act of creation, to defend the biblical narrative of the story of Bereshit, which, according to the Rambam, is creation ex nihilo, and creation from absolute nothingness. In the course of doing so, the Rambam did not really introduce us to any verses from the Torah. He needed to first philosophically argue that this was the most cogent theory for how the universe came into existence. And it's only after he spent many, many chapters disproving Aristotle, arguing against Plato, and then coming to the realization philosophically, logically, that creation from nothing is the only thing that makes sense in order for us to be able to embrace the doctrines of God and his creation in the proper way. The Rambam is now ready in chapter 30 to be able to look into some of the verses of the book of Genesis itself and to really analyze them using a lens of Aristotelian physics. In other words, even though from the Rambam standpoint, he's rejected the Aristotelian model of an eternal universe, eternity a parte ante, which means an eternity going all the way back into the past ad infinitum. He says that's not possible, but nonetheless, I still am an Aristotelian scientist. I subscribe to both Aristotle's methodology and to his physics and to the way that he described how the world is structured. And so I want to be able to find that in the book of Genesis itself, in the language that the Torah uses, in the way that it describes how all of reality came into existence, especially our sublunary reality, the reality that we exist in currently that is below the heavens. Now, this to me is a very, very important chapter because it really is a signal to us that even if we may have changed science in our time, we still need to subscribe to the Maimonidean methodology of once I have an established science of my time, let me apply it to the verses of Tanakh and see how they fit with the way that the Torah is describing. And as is necessary to appreciate, there's a certain elasticity to the words of the Chumash because the words are vague. And therefore, the way that the Rambam understood the words of the Chumash would probably differ from the way that we would understand the words of the Chumash in our efforts to try and fit it in with modern science. And so this is really part of the Rambam's preamble from the very end of chapter 29. I feel that I have a responsibility to at least give you a modicum of understanding of the act of creation, as I promised that I would do in the very introduction of Moreh Nevukhim. And his caution, therefore, to the reader is, number one, do not take the words of the Torah and the sages at face value, and only study Ma'aseh Bereshit after you have properly prepared yourself with a knowledge of science so that you can understand the story of creation properly. You need to know the rules of physics to know that when the Torah describes something, it's really making reference to something that is a scientific reality. For this reason, the sages caution carefully about the study of Ma'aseh Bereshit with the general public, because the general public lacks sufficient grounding in science to be able to really understand what the Torah is saying as far as how the world came into existence. Now, of course, if you try to study a subject material that that is so dramatic and so all-encompassing as the act of creation, and you misunderstand it, this could also lead one to misunderstand the nature of God. And that's where the danger comes in. The Rambam, after telling us that the Talmud does not want us to study Maaseh Bereshit with the general public, now has to explain, well, then what right do I have to put this in a book? A book that is available for all posterity to any person who picks up the book seems like it's part of the general realm. It's no longer with teaching it just to one student. I'm making this available to the general public. It's right. So what is my justification? So the Rambam writes, I must overflow some of my knowledge to others, but I will, and the reason I do so is because I have such a drive to share this knowledge. When you know that you have the truth, you feel a compulsion to be able to share it with others because you want to share truth with others. At the same time, I know that I have to be restrained about it. So therefore, I will do so with flashes only, leaving most of the information hidden. So it's quite interesting. The Rambam is not only sharing this knowledge for the sake of his readership, he's sharing this knowledge for his own sake, because when you have truth, you want to be able to share it with others. And then the second part of his introduction, very similar to what he started off with, is be aware that the prophets use words equivocally, which means that there are multiple meanings to words, as we're going to see, that even within the same paragraph, sometimes a word will mean one thing the first time it's used and something totally different the second time it's used. And these words are not meant to mean what they indicate according to their first signification or at first glance. So therefore, one needs to be extremely cautious. What the Rambam is therefore going to do in chapter 30 is he's going to give us slight flashes, as he said, little highlights of what we can extract from the language itself of the Torah to be able to appreciate that what is being described is a coming into existence from nothing of the laws of physics as Aristotle had described them. Okay, so the Rambam starts off this passage, this chapter, with a discussion of language in general. And he says, let me tell you something, that we have two ways of saying that something is first or something is primary. We have the idea of first and primary in English, and it's a little bit unclear. There's a bit of a discrepancy between Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibone's translation and Rabbi Kafich's translation. But the point is that we have the word first could mean different things depending upon its context. First can sometimes mean something that precedes other things in time, but first can also mean something that is the necessary predicate of everything that comes after it. But the two don't necessarily always mean the same thing at the same time. So for example, if I ask you, who got to the meeting first, It doesn't mean if I tell you that Bob got to the meeting first, that everyone else was dependent upon Bob's attendance in order to come to the meeting. But if I tell you this is the first strata of knowledge, then it means that everything else that comes above those areas of knowledge, the first strata of knowledge is sort of the foundation for everything else to come after it. So we need to appreciate that the word first can have different meanings depending upon its usage. And the Rambam tells us that there are slightly different words in Hebrew to describe this nuance. The former, something which is first, refers to something being first in time, such as Tchilat Diber Hashem b'Hosea. The very first prophecy that God had with Hosea is telling you what happened to come first in the chronicles of Hosea's life. But the latter, something that is primary, refers to something being primary or the main thing, which is why the word for head is Rosh, because the word for primary is Reshit, not Rishon or Techila, which just means first in time. Reshit means something that is primary. And the word Rosh, which is the head, is the primary organ of the human body, and so therefore it comes from the same word, Reshit. So the first word of the Torah is Be Reshit. And so you see where the Rambam is going. The Rambam is going to be telling us that when looking at the story of creation, we should not be looking at the word Reshit as what happened first, but what happened with primacy. Okay, what's the difference? So we'll see. The Rambam really feels a need to tell us that when the world was created, time was created concomitantly with all of physical reality. Before that moment of creation that happened whenever it happened, but part and parcel of that creation is the creation of time. Now, Big Bang theorists tell you the same thing, that time did not exist. So this part of the discussion really is where we could look at medieval science and certainly the Rambam's philosophy and say, this part seems to be very consistent with our understanding of how the world came into existence with modern cosmogony. Time is therefore a product of creation ex nihilo. That is to say that time did not exist before creation. So when the Torah describes creation, it cannot be in terms of when God created heaven and earth, because when would imply that time pre-existed creation. So rather, instead, you have to read the letter Bet as not when God created in the beginning, but rather it does not mean at the time of creation, but rather included or within creation was also included heaven and earth. You see, the letter Bet could mean when God created the world, or in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, which means at the time of. But again, saying something happened at a certain time implies that time pre-existed that event. And that's not possible because time was created as a product of the creation of all physical reality. Thus, the correct translation of Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz is within the creation of up high and down below, the following things were included in that incipient creation that happened. It didn't happen at a specific time. That's a misnomer because that implies that time predates creation. But when God included in that initial creation was time, was all of space, and all of things that are described in the first chapter of Genesis. Statements of the sages that imply that time existed before creation, those statements are very strange, which means the Rambam has difficulty contending with them. We saw a little bit about this back in chapter 26, and we'll make reference to that momentarily. They make their assertion based on their observation of the narrative that time, such as the first day, the second day, existed even before celestial bodies were placed into motion. They thus believe that time is eternal, existing outside of physical motion. Now, here what the Rambam, I believe, is getting to is the following. You look at the narrative of creation and you note that the celestial bodies were created on day 4. Now, if motion is the sort of the gauge of time, then it seems like time exists day 1, day 2, and day 3 before the celestial bodies are placed into motion. It seems that time exists before motion. before the motion of all the physical heavenly bodies, before the sun and the moon and the stars were put into place. And so therefore, there are some sages, asserts the Rambam, we'll see those midrashim in just a minute. Some of our sages believe that time existed before God created the things that are the gauges of time, which are the heavenly bodies. And if so, it follows that time may have even predated all of physical reality, according to these sages. And that's a mistake, says the Rambam. That's a fallacy. That's not true according to my understanding of creation. And he says the two midrashic statements which are strange appear in the same text. What are the two statements? This is from Bereshit Rabbah, chapter 3. The first statement is Amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Simon, Yehi erev ein k'tiv kan ela vayehi erev. It does not say that God said, let there be evening and let there be morning, but rather, and it was evening. It was morning. Mikan shahaya seder zmanim kodim lachein. This implies that even before the first day of creation, time existed, even before there was anything to gauge time. Okay, now I just want to reiterate something that we've mentioned in previous chapters. According to Aristotle, you cannot have time without motion, and you cannot have motion without time. So, in other words, to put it in more contemporary language for, let's say, our understanding of dimensions, there are three dimensions of space and there's one dimension of time. According to modern relativity, the two are directly interrelated and you cannot separate them. That's essentially coming from an Aristotelian origin. Okay, and so the sages are contradicting that. The sages are saying before there was any kind of motion of space, of day and night patterns, time still existed independently of that. And the second statement is Amar Rabbi Avahu, Melamed Shahaya Borei Olamot Macharivan Ad Shabarat Elu. This, from here we can infer that there were certain things that predated our creation, that God had created other worlds and destroyed them before bringing our world into creation, or into existence. And the Rambam says these two midrashic opinions are very problematic, and the second is even stranger than the first, because both seem to subscribe to this idea of time being eternal, a parte ante, in other words, even going backwards in time. I agree that our world exists eternally into the future, a parte post, but as we've stated in previous chapters, the world cannot exist a parte ante, because that's theologically incompatible with the belief in Judaism that God is providential. And because God is providential, he cannot exist concomitantly with anything else that is eternal. So therefore, God created time, brought everything into existence, all of physical reality with the creation of time. God is independent and outside of time. So therefore, what do you do with these midrashim? These two midrashic opinions are as problematic as the midrash we cited in chapter 26 from Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, where which the midrash in chapter 26, if you'd like to go back and listen to that presentation, that midrash implied that God created this world from pre-existing materials. And so now, of course, Kabbalistically, there is such a school that we are the fourth in a series of 7 worlds, as Rabbeinu Bechaya presents in a few places, and as many of the other commentaries present as well. The Abarbanel talks about this as well. But from a purely Aristotelian point of view, there is only one existence. It is our existence. It was created at the time of creation, including time. Okay, so in summation, says the Rambam, whenever you find words of our sages, like this, and here the Rambam is a little bit murky as to what he means. He says, you should not, in considering these points, I'm just reading on page 349, you should not, in considering these points, take into account the statements made by this one or that one. I have already made it known to you that the foundation of the whole law is the view that God has brought the world into being out of nothing without there having been a temporal beginning. for time is created, being consequent upon the motion of the sphere, which is created. So just to explain what the Rambam means here, the Meforshim grapple with exactly what the Rambam means. Does he mean to say that these sages are outside the pale of what I find to be theologically acceptable and scientifically accurate? That's one way of looking at it. And the Rambam would basically say, I'm going like the other opinions in the Midrash, which say that the world was created out of absolute nothing. But you could also look at the Rambam as suggesting that when you read the words of the sages, as he had used in his preamble at the end of chapter 29, you must appreciate that sometimes they speak allegorically. You are not meant to take their words literally. So even the statements of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon and Rabbi Avahu in the Medrash, even though they imply that time pre-existed our creation and that other worlds predated our creation, maybe there's another way of understanding those statements without them contradicting Aristotelian science and creatio ex nihilo. Now, what do you do with the fact that it seems like time pre-exists the motions of the celestial bodies? The answer to that is that there was a motion that started at the time of creation, even before God created the celestial bodies and placed them in the sky. What was that motion? There's a celestial sphere or a series of celestial spheres that are transparent, according to Aristotle, that God put into motion at the very beginning of creation. And that's the gauging of time. Not the planetary bodies, not the stars, not the moon, but the actual concentric spheres that are transparent. Their motion comes concomitantly with the existence of time. Okay, so that's the Rambam's theory. Next, section 4. Among the things to know about Ma'aseh Bereshit is the simultaneity of creation from nothing. And this, again, for the Rambam is very important, because if everything was created from nothing, then everything was created from nothing. There's no such thing as a partial creation from nothing and then a subsequent creation from something. Everything that God brought into existence is absolutely perfect, coming essentially directly from God in a miraculous phenomenon of creatio ex nihilo, bria yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. And that means that everything happened simultaneously. That means that when the Torah says, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, you may recall from a previous chapter that the Rambam had cited the Gemara in Tractate Chagiga, which asked the question, which came first, heaven or earth? And there was the opinion of Beit Shammai, who says that the heavens came first, and the opinion of Beit Hillel, which says the earth came first. But then we had the opinion of the Chachamim, of the sages, Zeh vazeh ke'echat nivra'u. Each one was created together. They were created simultaneously. So the Rambam says that's the correct opinion from a scientific vantage point. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are speaking about perhaps philosophical ideas, but not about what actually happened historically. Furthermore, the Rambam quotes a medrash in Bereshit Rabbah, which says that when that initial moment, that big bang, if you will, took place and everything was brought into existence, that includes everything, even those things which are stated to have been created on subsequent days of creation. But what it means is that it wasn't just that those things were created later, but rather it means that everything that would manifested itself in later periods of creation, all of those things were created immediately and instantaneously, simultaneous with the rest of creation. Et hashamayim, says the Medrash, lerabot chama ulevana umazalot, ve'et haaretz lerabot ilanot udeshain vegan eden. Essentially, what the Medrash is saying is that when it says that God created the heavens, it means not just blank heavens, empty heavens. It means heavens that would eventually be populated with stars and the sun, because all of those were created, but just didn't come to their fruition as being put in their place as they exist now until a later period of creation. And the same thing, when God created all of our earthly realm, he put everything into place. And he says this is also borne by scripture in Isaiah, that Korei ani alehem ya'amdu yachtav, that God says after describing how I formed earth and heaven, I said that they should stand together. In other words, I commanded creation to come into existence all at once, everything at the same time. And therefore, the Rambam writes, creation is thus like the farmer who plants all of his seeds at the same time, but different crops will grow at different times. You plant wheat and barley, barley grows faster than wheat, but the planting of it and the formation of it coming into existence all took place at the same time. How it manifested itself over the course of this creation period, which may have taken, for all we know, billions of years. All of these things evolved naturally over the course of time. Everything according to its nature would come and manifest itself. And therefore, he says, with this, we can explain what caused Rebbe Yehuda or Rebbe Shimon his doubt as far as how time could pre-exist the world. He said, how could it be that time could exist before the existence of the sun, the moon, and the stars on day 4, right? So in reality, time was created at the first moment of creation with the creation of the spheres, but it wasn't manifest to human perception in moving celestial bodies until later. This actually may be even a precursor to the whole idea of quantum physics, which subscribes to the idea that in order for things to work the way that they do in modern physics, there must be an observer. But I'm not going to go there right now because that's clearly not where the Rambam's head is, but we certainly see some parallels to that. The Rambam is essentially saying time and motion were not manifest to the observer until day 4, when God allowed that which he had put into motion at the first, that incipient moment of creation, put everything into motion with the Big Bang, with that initial creation. But when did the stars and the sun and the moon start to be manifest? That didn't happen until day 4 of the creation. And he says this is reflected by the sages. I'm not making this up, because it says in the Talmud in Tractate Chagiga, once again on page 12, or Shebara Kadosh Baruch Hu B'Yom Harishon, the light that God created on the very first day is, how do you translate that if there was no sun to illuminate that light? What was that light? So we have different opinions as to whether that's the same light or the different light, but the Chachamim say, the sages say, Hein hein me'orot shenivru bayom rishon, velo nitlu ad yom revi'i. Yes, there was a light, perhaps you could call it an energy, that pervaded all of the universe even before there was sort of the cooling off of our universe so that celestial bodies could become manifest as circling around our globe. But that light eventually sort of solidified into a glowing orb that we call our sun. Okay, so however you're going to translate that into the Big Bang Theory and the way that cosmologists describe the origins of the universe, we leave that to you. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. Now, so that concludes that discussion over there about the Rambam wanted to clarify what exactly happened at the first moment of creation, that everything was created at that first moment, and it was only a manifestation of creation that continued to evolve over the full 6 days of creation. Now the Rambam goes into this discussion of equivocality and terminology. If you recall, at the end of chapter 29, the Rambam had said we're going to encounter certain words which have dual meanings depending upon the context, and we need to appreciate that when we study the words of the Chumash, so that we don't get confused about what the Torah means. The word eretz means earth or land, but the Rambam says that it has really 2 meanings in the very first psukim of the book of Bereshit, of the book of Genesis. Sometimes the word eretz does not mean earth in the way that we understand it, but sometimes it refers to all sublunary matter. So it's sort of like a synonym with the word chomer, material, raw earthly material. But sometimes it can mean only one of the 4 base elements that are described in Greek philosophy as making up all of a sublunary material. So sometimes it means all of matter, and sometimes it's one of the 4 elements of earth, wind, fire, and water. So here's an example of when it refers to all of sublunary matter. the very second verse of Genesis, V'ha'aretz hayita tohu vavohu. The earth was chaos and void. This does not refer to the land, because there was no visible land to describe at this point in the creation narrative anyway, but rather it means that all of physical reality was chaos and void. All of what we associate with our physical existence was chaos and void. And this affirms the idea of creation ex nihilo as applying to all sublunary matter, unlike Plato, because here the verse is basically saying that this was part of the creation. It's not that there was pre-existing material, but rather at the moment of creation, when God brought everything into existence, including all of sublunary matter, it was in a state of chaos and void, and it had to sort of become in its organized state over the course of the period of creation. But then, just a few verses later, the word eretz is used in a totally different way. An example of when it refers only to the element of earth is on day 3 of creation, when God says to the water should recede so that dry land might become visible. So when that dry land became visible, what does the verse say in verse 10 of Genesis? Vayikra Elokim layabasha eretz. God called that dry land eretz. So you have two words that are exactly the same. One means all of matter in Genesis chapter 2, and one means just earth, the land itself, one of the four elements in verse 10. And the Rambam here then says, we can learn a very valuable principle from what I've just demonstrated, is that any time the Torah says that God called something by a particular name, it is for the purpose of identifying that at this point, we are departing from its original way in which it was used. So when it says that God called the dry land Eretz, it means that previously the word Eretz meant something totally different. It had an equivocal meaning, and now it's changed its meaning for the colloquial use of mankind, so that when we think of the word Eretz, it no longer means all of matter, but rather it just means one of the four elements, the thing that we step on and the thing that we plant seeds into. Okay, next section. The four created sublunary elements, earth, water, air, and fire, are mentioned in short order after the mention of heaven's creation. And here again, the Rambam wants to confirm that contained within the psukim of Genesis are you find a description of an Aristotelian depiction of reality. Again, since Aristotle believed in this four-element universe, you must sort of find this in the words of the Torah as well. So where do you find mention of the four elements? So the first one is v'ha'aretz. Aretz hayta tohu vavohu. That's an allusion to the word eretz that will be used later in the Torah to describe one element, which is the element of earth. Then it says v'choshech al pnei tahom, and there was darkness on the face of the deep. Now that word darkness, according to the Rambam, means specifically the element of fire, or an allusion to the element of fire. Now you may ask a very simple question. How does the word darkness allude to the element of fire? So the Rambam first, tells us that there are many psukim that associate fire with darkness when we're talking about a certain kind of elemental fire. And he says that when you look back in the description in the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim, about how God gave us the Torah atop Mount Sinai, it says that Udvarav shamata mitoch ha'esh. In Devarim chapter 4, it says you heard God's words from amidst the fire. And then in the very next chapter, it says, Vayihi keshomachem et hakol mitoch hachoshech. But when you heard the voice of God from the darkness, vehahar boer ba'esh, and the mountain was burning with fire. So how could something be on fire and still be coming from a place of darkness? So the Rambam tells us that there's a concept that he learned about from Aristotle, that there is something called an elemental fire. This is a very foreign concept to us, but when Aristotle described the four elements, he didn't just describe that the universe or our world is made up of four different elements combined in different proportions and combinations. But he also believed that there are four different strata of elemental existence. The lowest and heaviest element is the element of earth, and therefore it is the lowest stratum of our existence. Above earth, there's a layer of water, which is the oceans and seas and rivers that cover all of the earth, except for certain portions where the earth is permitted to be revealed. Above that is a layer of air, which is our atmosphere. And above the layer of air is what he calls elemental fire, a layer of fire. As a matter of fact, according to Aristotle, the source of warmth that pervades our planet does not come from the sun, but rather comes from an invisible layer of invisible fire that radiates down through the other elements of air, water, and earth to keep everything warm. So yes, the entire sublunary world is made up of different combinations of earth, wind, fire, and water, but there are also four different layers or strata, if you will, of these elements that exist writ large that make up sort of like a multi-layered world that we live in. And so therefore, choshech is this invisible fire that with a backdrop of dark sky is also dark as well. Okay, and then the word ruach, the ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim, the spirit of God or the wind of God is hovering over the face of the water. This is a reference to air. And the reason why it's called the air of God is because anytime something is in motion, like the wind which is blowing, it is described in Tanakh as God causing that wind to blow. So it's a way of helping man understand what is the cause of atmospheric wind that blows, that the winds blow constantly. And that's how man is able to detect the existence of air all around him, is when he feels a breeze blowing against his face. And the Rambam brings several psukim to indicate that. I'm going to have to sort of move a little bit faster because I'd like to finish to the end of the midsection, at least, of chapter 30 today. And then finally, water, which is the fourth of the four elements, is also the Ruach Elokim merachefet, the spirit of God or the air of God was hovering over what? On the face of the water. So we've covered earth, we've covered fire, we've covered air, and we've covered water. The Rambam also points out that if you read the psukim a certain way, you can actually read them as being depicted according to their strata, going from the highest, which is air, then fire, then going to air, then going to water, and earth sort of being the overarching element, because at this point in the pasuk, it doesn't just mean earth, but it also means all four elements as well. Another equivocal term is not only the word eretz, but is also the word choshech, darkness. In the first instance, as we just mentioned, it was used to describe this elemental fire, this layer of fire that is above our atmosphere. But in the second instance, it is used to describe the darkness of night, because in verse 5, it says, Vayikra Elokim la'or yom v'lachoshech kara layla, that God called the night darkness. So this is consistent with our thesis that God says, I'm calling this darkness because previously it was used for something else. You have the same equivocality in the term mayim with the word water. It's number 8 in our handout, in our outline. Now, this gets into a little bit more of a deeper discussion about this whole idea of what water is. Water, as we know, is one of the most formless elements, or it's given to multiple different forms because of its fluidity. Now, the Rambam therefore says that there's an equivocality in the use of the term water, and that it means different things depending upon where God deposited that water. And as we'll see in the verses, there is a place in the Torah where God creates a divide between the upper waters and the lower waters. And what exactly that means is very unclear. When God divided the lower waters and the upper waters, as the psukim relate in verses 6 and 7 of Genesis chapter 1, it doesn't simply mean that there was a spatial division, that there was this thing called water, fully formed water, and God placed a layer above the firmament and a layer below the firmament. Not at all. But rather, according to the Rambam, this water was an elemental water, like this primordial water, which had not yet been given its full form. And God gave the water that is part of the lower realm a particular form that we find in a glass of water or in an ocean, but he gave the upper waters a completely different form, which is quite different from the way that we find water in our realm that is beneath the atmosphere. So he says there was a more basic elemental water that was described in the earlier verse, Al Pinei Hamayim, which is why God gave a special name to the lower water. It says, Ulamikvei Hamayim Karayamim, that God called the divisions of water that we find in our bodies of water, he called them oceans. Similarly, the upper waters, although unnamed, we don't know what they would be called as of yet. They have a different quality from both the elemental water and the earthly water of the oceans. And thus, God's division between the two waters is analogous to his division between light and darkness. Each realm of light and darkness has a unique form because one is light and one is dark. Similarly, the two waters are as different from each other as night and day. The firmament, says the Rambam, is also made of water which is congealed. And this he brings proof from a midrash, which says, Bishasha Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yehi Rakia B'toch HaMayim, that when God said, let there be a firmament, Galda Tipa Ha'emtzait V'na'asu HaShamayim HaTachtonim U'Shmei Shamayim HaElyonim. There was a middle layer of water that congealed. And it was this that caused there to be a division between the upper waters and the lower waters, a congealed layer of water. Now, what this all means is very mysterious. I'll get to that in just a second. But then the Rambam says, we see from the verse number 8, that God called the firmament Shamayim. It shows that this demonstrates that the word Shamayim, which we translated also as heavens, is also an equivocal term, sometimes meaning the firmament that God placed in the heavens, and sometimes it means the heavenly realm, a completely celestial realm that is completely different in its entire structure and makeup from what we experience in our sublunary realm. The Rambam seems to be understanding that the word rakia is part of our sublunary realm, is part of the realm that is below the celestial spheres. However, the word shamayim can sometimes be used to describe the firmament of water that is within our sublunary realm, and sometimes it's used in its more conventional name as the heavenly realm. So there are therefore three types of water, says the Rambam. The water of the oceans, the firmament, which is that congealed body of water in the sky, and finally, heated water that is part of the layer of air that is nearby the elemental fire layer. Now, according to Rabbi Chastai Kreskes, who's an Aristotelian philosopher rabbi who interpreted the Moreh Nevukhim as a running commentary on the Moreh Nevukhim, he explains that what the Rambam is describing here is the meteorological conditions of clouds and of mists that you can find sometimes in high altitudes. In mountainous regions, you find layers of clouds and mist. And he says that's exactly what is being described here, that when God created the lower waters, that's the waters that we find that are just above the earth. The rakia, the firmament, is this congealed mass of clouds, which are basically condensed water droplets. So it's water in a different form, in the form of mist, in the form of clouds. And that above that is a heated layer of water droplets, which are completely invisible because they are heated by the elemental fire, which is above our atmosphere. That's what the Rambam seems to be describing, at least according to Kreskes. And it seems like there are other Meforshim, classical Meforshim, who understand the Rambam that way as well. And then the Rambam writes that we also note from the verse, Vayitain otam Elokim birakia hashamayim, that God placed all of the celestial bodies within this firmament, within the heavenly realm. Here, the Rambam understands that the word rakia does not mean the same kind of layer of clouds that are within our sublunary realm. But just like the word shamayim is used equivocally, so is the word rakia used equivocally to sometimes describe the celestial spheres that exist above our sublunary realm. And here in this verse, when it says that God placed, in verse 17, that God placed the celestial bodies, the sun, the stars, and the moon, he placed them within the firmament. It means in the celestial spheres that make up a totally different realm above the moon. And so what the Rambam sees from that is that because it says Birakia Hashemayim, within, God embedded the planets within the spheres, and they're not just on the surface of the spheres as the vulgar imagine. Then he gets back to the idea of water. The fact that water is above the rakia, and the fact that that water is different from our earthly water, is also demonstrated by the story of Arba'a Shenichnasu Lapardes, the 4 rabbis who entered into the orchard or to the paradise. And you know from that story, we've seen it before in Tractate Chagiga, chapter page 14b. Rabbi Akiva said to his fellow sages that were these 4 sages that were entering into this realm of philosophical speculation, according to the Rambam, that Rabbi Akiva said to them, Kisha'atem magian eitzel avnei shayish tahor, when you get to the pure marble stones, al tomru mayim mayim, do not proclaim water, water. Now, what the Rambam sees from that story is that there are many different ways of describing what we call mayim. There are many different manifestations of mayim, of water. There is water that we find in our oceans and in a glass of water, but there's also water that has a completely different form, a more ethereal form, a more misty form. And apparently what the Rambam is trying to convey with this citation is, what you note from here is that you can have a vision of something that appears to be somewhat otherworldly and still consider it to be water, because water can take on many different forms depending upon where you find it in the stratified sublunary realm. So therefore, just like we find water taking on many different shapes and sizes and manifestations, so too Rabbi Akiva used the term mayim in a borrowed sense to describe what they would encounter in this transcendent realm that they would enter into, where they would see things that seemed bizarre or strange to them, and they would call them water for the reason that water can manifest itself in so many different ways. And so it's not really clear how the Rambam understands that passage, but certainly it stands to reason that there's a very big difference between marble stones and water. Marble stones are things that are solidified and have very concrete and discrete edges and corners, and we know where they begin and where they end. Water is perhaps especially in the higher realms, is something that it's not as clear with a cloud where it starts and where it ends. And that was the caution that Rabbi Akiva was giving to his colleagues, which is, be very careful in how you define what is existing in this celestial realm. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop it here today because we've gone way over time. But we will conclude with number 9 on our handout. We'll expand it and we'll conclude Bezrat Hashem chapter 30 next week. I want to thank you for joining me today. And again, the last few weeks have been a little bit longer than a half hour. I hope that we'll be able to get back to our regular 30-minute presentation as the chapters ensue. Have a wonderful day and the rest of the week, everyone.